here again with Victor Buchli. We have already been with here another day speaking about home cultures and the study of home and this interesting journal approaching the topic. And our topic today is related but slightly different. We are going to be speaking on material culture and its study. Victor Buchli is a professor at the University College London. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back.
And he is, in fact, a professor on material culture. He's a specialist on that, and he does a kind of strange archaeology that I didn't know about it. Tell us a little bit, what do you do normally as an archaeologist of the present?
Well, I was trained, obviously, as an archaeologist, but I worked on the archaeology of the 20th century, particularly the archaeology of Marxist material culture. At the time when I started my study, there was a Marxist archaeology, but there wasn't an archaeology of Marxism. And so I was very intrigued to understand how Marxism works or worked itself out in the home, in the material culture of the domestic sphere, within architecture. And so I started my first research in Moscow just after the collapse of the Soviet Union to look at the history of utopian living and planning in relation to a utopian socialist housing complex where one, in fact, had a true Marxian material culture, where there really was an archaeology of Marxism, because all the artifacts, all the buildings, all the wallpaper, the sinks, the toilets, the beds, the sheets, the pots, the pans, the furniture, everything was, in fact, Marxist.
But this is really strange. I mean, it was not Marx the one who fought the utopians, socialists in the 19th century. So how it could become utopian, this Marxian project on home?
Well, I say utopian, but in many respects, the original complex, though in a sense having been reviled as a utopia later on by critics, nonetheless had an enormous impact in terms of the way we think about architecture, the way we think about material culture. So as an archaeologist, I was trying to understand how we can analyze a Marxist material culture, a material culture that was basically created on the basis of Marxian principles in terms of the organization of daily life, in terms of the organization of the city, and in terms of the construction of buildings.
And how does this contrast with the material culture of capitalist developments in the house?
That's a very good question, and a rather difficult one to get at, though a very, very important one. This question probably was best exemplified in the famous Nixon-Khrushchev kitchen debates in 1959, if I recall.
Domesticity at war.
Exactly. This is when the Cold War was cooling down. It was literally getting colder. And when also it became a question of not simply competing between two military industrial complexes and two economic ideologies, but also competing between two understandings of the good life in relationship to the home. And in many respects, this was an understanding of two competing visions for the industrialization of domestic life at home, and two competing understandings of consumption, because we do have a capitalist form of consumption, but we most certainly do have a socialist form of consumption. And so these two forms of consumption were basically in competition with one another at that time. And what is very clear is that there is a capitalist washing machine and there is a communist washing machine. There are capitalist pots and pans and there are communist pots and pans. And even though they may look alike, they are distinctly different in terms of the infrastructures they function in and in terms of the way in which they structure daily life in relation to the wider spheres of social and political life.
How was this socialist washing machine working? What was the difference with our laundries or in London, I don't know, or in the USA?
In many respects, many of these kinds of domestic material artifacts look very similar, but they function socially and ideologically in vastly different ways. Differences are also sort of evident in maybe small nuances of design as well, too. But what is more important is how, in a sense, they functioned within the working of the home and what the home was supposed to do socially and how it was supposed to fit within the wider sphere of political and social life. So the reason why it's important to study these things is because we can oftentimes be deceived by superficial similarities. We think we're looking at the same thing, but we're not looking at the same thing. We're looking at things that are profoundly different from one another.
Victor, and what do denote, what do refer when we speak about material culture? There is something that is distinctly material in culture. That what is the content of the material culture subject of a study? They are washing machines. They are objects. They are what?
Well, material culture is essentially all the material artifacts that human beings have produced ever since the very first stone tools that distinguished us as tool makers from other primates. And the way in which our ability to make tools, to make artifacts, have basically gone hand in hand with the way in which our understanding of society had evolved over millennia. So material culture has always been the key means of understanding human social life. And it's probably the most immediate context in which people interact with one another.
Yes, but the question today for many of us is what's material and what is not, because we are living in a very much dematerializing production system. Is knowledge, for example, material? In what sense is sensoriality something material also? The feelings, the experiences are material?
That's a very good question. The question of the immaterial in relation to the material. And I just wrote a book on that subject about the immaterial and how we understand that from a material culture point of view. Because even though we speak a great deal about the immateriality of knowledge, the immateriality of the internet and the World Wide Web, we forget to focus upon what are the material conditions that produce that sense of immateriality. Because in many respects, immateriality is a nonsense. It is always understood negatively in relation to some material thing. So ultimately, all our understandings of the immaterial, all of those sort of things that we think of in terms of mind or spirit, are very much materially understood. It's a question of shifting the focus of our analysis to those areas that produce our sense of mind, presents our sense of spirit, that produce the immaterial.
But we do not want to go back to materialism and empiriocriticism and this kind of realistic epistemologies, or do we?
Well, I think we have to understand that we live nonetheless in a material world. And in that respect, for living in a material world and interacting with each other through artifacts, that the conditions of that materiality need to be understood in order to understand how we work as social beings. So even in things that we think of as immaterial, such as mind, spirit, or feeling, these all have material conditions under which they emerge. And we must be focused on those nuances in order to understand how those notions of mind, spirit, and the immaterial.
So materiality is not an object, something separated from the network that makes sense. It's rather the conditions that produce the object.
Indeed, indeed. And your emphasis on the object is important because an object is very different from a thing or even just materiality. The object is a certain kind of concentration of elements with a particular kind of role socially to perform, which is very different from, say, a mere thing or, say, from materiality per se as a set of material qualities.
So would you say that there is a return to some of these topics into anthropology after the 19th century when material culture was one of the big ones in the discipline?
Yes, indeed. In the 19th century, our key texts were, frankly, artifacts. This is what we could bring back. This is what was our evidence within the imperial capitals at the time. And then, of course, with the rise of social anthropology, the rise of the ethnographic method, where anthropologists would go into the field and collect data and study other aspects of social life, the notion of the material and material culture started, in a sense, to recede as an important source of information. But I would say, particularly in the West, particularly in the Euro-American tradition, in the post-war period, there was a return, partly because of industrialization, consumerism, post-war recovery, but also in terms of rising social movements, anti-consumerist critique, the rise of a socialist critique of consumer society in the West, and also the rise of feminism, and also with that the rise of a gay movement as well too. So all of these social movements come together in order to understand the material in an important way, in order to understand consumerism and how that shapes lives.
And would not be a kind of humbleness that I like in the idea of thinking the whole through the little, through objects. We are trying to figure out how the world or the universe, the social universe is through objects, rather than having this position that we own or we know how the system works, you know. There is something that I appreciate in this return of the thing, which is, well, sometimes it's easier and much more tangible to know something about a song or about a pencil or about a poem or about a laundry or a washing machine than saying, no, that's capitalism, you know. It's like more human scale.
Indeed. In many respects, a focus on the material has a means of drawing people together. Bruno Latour really pointed this out very, very clearly when he speaks about the ding or thing and the way in which things brings people together. So almost as a rhetorical trope, so to speak, the focus on everyday objects, the focus on things, has a means of concentrating people's attention, focusing it, and bringing people together around a particular object or question, and thereby provide a very effective means by which one can interrogate the wider structures in which things and ourselves as people are entailed.
So things are never just things, are places for encounters.
Indeed.
And there is a musician who wrote that the telephones have no conversations. So with this nice conversation, I would like to find and just inviting our listeners to reflect on the importance of material life, on the things that surround us, that sometimes we take them as something which is either insignificant or banal, but instead it's rather a point where you can focus and understand the world you are part of.
In this respect, I think the banal is very important and has an enormous power that goes unrecognized, and for that reason must be understood better.
Thank you very much, Victor, and see you again soon, I hope.
I hope so indeed. Thank you.
Goodbye.